When the prison gates of Columbia Correctional Institution closed behind Jeffrey Dahmer in 1992, the world expected chaos. Reporters predicted riots, guards prepared for threats, and psychologists wondered how a man responsible for such horror would survive among ordinary inmates. But the monster they expected never appeared. Instead, they met a man disturbingly quiet, polite, calm, and unervingly ordinary. Dahmer's first days inside were described by staff as eerily smooth. He followed orders, thanked officers, and asked only for a Bible. His cell was sparse: a narrow bed, a metal desk, and a small mirror bolted to the wall. No posters, no letters, no traces of personality. To the untrained eye, he was just another prisoner. But to those who spent hours watching him, there was something different, something that fell off even in silence. One correctional officer later recalled, he didn't fidget, didn't look around. He'd just sit there and stare, like time didn't apply to him. Another said Dahmer seemed almost content with confinement, as if the walls brought him comfort instead of punishment. He rarely joined others in the yard. He preferred reading alone, usually with his head slightly tilted down, murmuring passages under his breath. Psychologists noted his composure. During assessments, he spoke clearly and logically, acknowledging his crimes without emotion. When asked why he did what he did, his answer remained the same. It wasn't about hate, it was about control. Yet, control was exactly what prison stripped away, or should have. In Dahmer's case, it became a different kind of experiment. Guards assigned his block began keeping informal notes, habits, routines, behaviors. Every morning at 6:30, Dahmer folded his blanket precisely in thirds. At 7 o'clock, he polished his metal sink with tissue until it shone. Breakfast was always the same: toast first, then eggs, never together. It wasn't ritual for order's sake. It was ritual for sanity. He once told a prison counselor, "If I stop structuring my day, my mind starts to wander." Those wanderings, however, were not always peaceful. A few inmates later claimed Dahmer spoke to himself at night. They'd hear soft whispers, pauses, then low laughter. When one prisoner confronted him, Dahmer simply smiled and said, "Just talking to memories." Others thought he was mocking them, especially the ones who knew who he was. Inside Columbia, his reputation spread faster than any official memo. To most inmates, he was beyond redemption, the Milwaukee Monster. Some refused to eat when he entered the cafeteria. Others tried to provoke him, but Dahmer rarely reacted. The calmness that once fooled neighbors now infuriated prisoners. A former cell block orderly said, "He didn't look scared, and that scared everyone else." Yet behind the routine and the mask of civility, Dahmer seemed fascinated by his own transformation. He often asked the prison librarian for psychology textbooks, particularly those about moral reasoning. He underlined sections about guilt and empathy. In the margins, he scribbled questions, short phrases like, "Is remorse real and born or made?" None of these writings left the library. They were destroyed after his death. But witnesses remembered the tone, part curiosity, part confession. Dahmer also began attending chapel services. The chaplain, Reverend Roy Ratcliffe, remembered his first meeting vividly. He looked tired, Ratcliffe said, like someone who'd lived 2 lifetimes already. Dahmer asked if he could be baptized. Ratcliffe agreed, and in 1994, the ceremony took place in the prison's small chapel. For many, it was a moment of hope, but for the officers who watched from the corner, it was unsettling. One later remarked, "He smiled while the water touched his face. I didn't know if that meant peace or something darker." Even as Dahmer spoke of faith, his cell told a different story. During a random inspection, guards found folded pages tucked beneath his mattress. Crude sketches of rooms, outlines of human figures, and handwritten notes referencing Reconstruction. When questioned, Dahmer dismissed them as therapy drawings. The papers were confiscated and logged, but never publicly released. Some believed they were blueprints of memory, maps of what he couldn't forget. By 1993, prison staff began noticing a strange duality in him. He'd help mop floors without complaint. Then hours later, he'd sit alone, expression blank, whispering Bible verses mixed with fragments of police reports he'd memorized. He once told another inmate, You can't undo what's built inside you, but you can cage it. It was as if he viewed himself not as human anymore, but as a specimen under study, even in his own mind. Then came the incident with the food tray. Inmates reported that Dahmer shaped his mashed potatoes into a crude form and said, "This looks familiar." Some laughed, others were disgusted. A week later, someone tried to cut him with a sharpened toothbrush. Dahmer didn't fight back. He simply said, "I expected it." That event changed how guards handled him. They increased his supervision, though he never requested protection. "If it happens, it happens," he told one officer. "Maybe I deserve it." Still, the calm remained. To the uninitiated, it looked like faith. To the experienced, it looked like resignation. Late that year, a maintenance worker found scratches on Dahmer's cell wall, faint etchings forming a cross inside a circle. No one confirmed he carved it, but when asked, he said, "It's a reminder that walls don't erase what's inside." In that moment, even the guards admitted feeling a chill. They weren't looking at a monster anymore. They were looking at something worse, a man who had learned to live with his darkness. As winter 1993 drew to a close, Dahmer's life inside Columbia had settled into a rhythm of silence. But beneath the calm, a slow storm was gathering, one that would soon expose the hidden records, the interviews, and the chilling files that prison psychologists quietly call the unseen dossier. And it was only a matter of time before someone opened it. By early 1994, a quiet storm was brewing inside Columbia Correctional Institution. Officially, Jeffrey Dahmer was just another inmate serving multiple life sentences. Unofficially, he had become the subject of a classified psychological study, an internal initiative of the Department of Corrections called Project Resurrection. Within those sealed folders lay hundreds of pages of notes, interviews, and behavior logs, what staff came to refer to as the Dahmer dossier. These were not ordinary reports. They were glimpses into the mind of a man the world could not categorize. Was he truly remorseful, or had he simply learned to mimic it? Every line written about Dahmer tried to answer that question, and none succeeded. The first interview in the file was dated January 8th, 1994. Conducted by prison psychologist Dr. Lane Morgan, it began with a simple inquiry. "Do you believe you've changed?" Dahmer's response was immediate. "Changed? No. I understand myself better. That's all." When pressed further, he added, "People think prison fixed me. It didn't. It just made me honest." Morgan's report noted an absence of emotional reactivity and intellectualized self-reflection bordering on detachment. He spoke about his crimes as though they were data, something to analyze, not regret. "I know what I did was evil," he said, "but I can't undo the way I think. I can only stop acting on it." The tone of the report chilled even veteran staff. It suggested not redemption, but containment. A man who knew the boundaries of his darkness and had simply accepted them. Inside his cell, Dahmer had started keeping a small notebook. Guards were instructed to log its contents during weekly searches. Most pages were harmless. Bible quotes, daily reflections, reminders like pray after breakfast. But in between those lines were cryptic notes. Still observe people. Patterns remain, and voices of reason quieter than before. What he meant by voices remains unknown. Some psychologists believed he was referring to his intrusive thoughts. Others feared something deeper, that he was still analyzing human behavior from the inside, turning prison life into a new kind of experiment. Later that month, Dahmer attended another session, this time with Reverend Roy Ratcliffe, the prison minister who had baptized him. Ratcliffe described him as calm but searching. During one conversation, Dahmer said, "I believe God forgives, but I don't think I should." Ratcliffe tried to reassure him, but Dahmer only smiled faintly. "Forgiveness doesn't erase memory," he said. "I live with pictures no one should see." That sentence made its way into the official record under the heading Residual Guilt and Visual Recall. Psychologists concluded that Dahmer's nightmares and flashbacks were vivid and continuous. In one written evaluation, he claimed he could still smell formaldehyde, the same chemical he used in his experiments years before. But perhaps the most disturbing entries came not from Dahmer's interviews, but from what guards later discovered among his confiscated mail. He had been receiving letters, hundreds of them, from strangers across the country. Some expressed sympathy, others fascination, and a few disturbingly romantic. Most of these were harmless. But one exchange stood out. An unsigned letter, postmarked from Illinois, contained a single sentence: "You're still being watched." Dahmer never reported it. Instead, he wrote a reply: "I know." The return address was fake. The letter disappeared into the archive. Within weeks, rumors spread that Dahmer had become paranoid. He often stood near his cell window for long stretches, staring into the corridor as if waiting for someone. One officer described it as the stare of a man who's seen too much and expects more. The unseen files also documented how Dahmer became an unintended celebrity inside prison walls. Fellow inmates either feared him or mocked him. He became a fascination for journalists and criminologists alike. One professor from Wisconsin requested access to interview him for a thesis on ritual psychology and compulsion. The request was denied. Still, portions of Dahmer's file were copied and distributed internally, fragments of his written confessions, his sketches, even his behavioral assessments. Each document revealed contradictions. In one section, Dahmer spoke about empathy, claiming he wished he could feel what normal people feel. In another, he admitted that part of him missed the control he once had. He told Dr. Morgan, "It's not the act I miss, it's the silence that came after." Those words haunted her. Silence was, in fact, Dahmer's constant companion. He thrived in it. He avoided noise, avoided conflict, avoided life. But silence was also what made him most dangerous, because in quiet moments, he returned to his thoughts. By summer of 1994, the Dahmer dossier had grown so large that the warden restricted access. Only 3 people could read it without written approval. But inside those pages was something the prison didn't want leaked: documentation of Dahmer's increasing isolation and growing tension among other inmates. Reports showed several threats made against him, often scrawled on the walls. "Monster must burn. You're next." Dahmer dismissed them with a shrug. "I expected it," he told an officer. "Everyone wants closure." Yet in his final recorded interview, dated November 20th, 1994, Dahmer made a chilling remark. "Some people think justice ends with prison. I think justice ends when I stop existing." No one realized that statement was a countdown. 8 days later, Jeffrey Dahmer would walk into a prison gym for his morning work detail. He'd mop the floor, joke with another inmate, and in less than an hour, his story would come to an end. Not through the system, but through another man's hands. And when investigators opened his locker one last time, they found only 2 things: a Bible and a notebook he never finished. The final entry reading simply, "I'm ready to leave the experiment." November 28th, 1994. The air inside Columbia Correctional Institution was still and gray. Breakfast trays clattered in the distance, echoing down the concrete hall. For most inmates, it was an ordinary Monday. For Jeffrey Dahmer, it was the end of the experiment he had once said he could never leave. At 7:45 a.m., Dahmer reported for his assigned duty, janitorial work in the prison gym. 2 other inmates were scheduled beside him: Jesse Anderson, serving time for murder, and Christopher Scarver, a quiet but unpredictable man known for his violent outbursts. Normally, a guard would supervise the cleaning crew. That morning, due to staff shortages, they were left alone. Witnesses later recalled that Dahmer looked calm. He greeted a passing officer with a nod, holding his mop over one shoulder like a soldier reporting for duty. No one noticed anything unusual. But within the hour, Columbia Correctional Institution would erupt in confusion and blood-chilling silence. At 8:10 a.m., a call came to the radio: "Medical emergency in the gym." When guards arrived, they found 2 men on the floor. Dahmer lay motionless, his head bleeding from severe trauma. Jesse Anderson was nearby, barely alive. Standing between them was Christopher Scarver, silent, steady, and holding a steel bar torn from exercise equipment. He dropped it as officers approached and said only one sentence: "God told me to do it." Dahmer was pronounced dead less than 20 minutes later. The official report: the Department of Corrections quickly labeled the attack an isolated act of inmate violence. Yet those who worked inside Columbia knew better. Tension had been building for months. Many prisoners despised Dahmer for his crimes, but also for his strange calm, his quiet jokes, his half-smiles that never reached his eyes. Some claimed he mocked others during meal prep, shaping food into grim symbols. Others said he whispered verses under his breath that sounded like confessions. To inmates like Scarver, who believed in divine retribution, that behavior was unforgivable. When investigators questioned him, Scarver's explanation was blunt. "I was doing the Lord's work," he said. "He mocked creation. I ended it." Inside Dahmer's cell, guards found no weapons, no letters of warning, only a Bible on his desk and a handwritten note wedged between its pages. "My sins are many. My time is short. Forgive me or don't. Either way, I understand." Aftermath in the prison. News of his death spread across the facility within minutes. Some inmates cheered. Others fell silent. One officer later described the atmosphere as relief mixed with disbelief. Dahmer had survived threats, fights, and isolation, only to die while mopping a gym floor. For days, the prison operated under lockdown. Reporters surrounded the front gates, shouting questions about safety, religion, and vengeance. Officials released only a short statement. Inmate Jeffrey Dahmer is deceased following an altercation with another inmate. Nothing more. But inside the walls, the truth circulated in whispers. A guard who had spoken to Dahmer the night before claimed the killer seemed oddly peaceful. He said he'd been reading Revelation, the guard recalled. He looked at me and said, "I think it's almost over." At the time, the officer thought he meant spiritual closure. The next morning proved otherwise. The warden ordered Dahmer's personal effects boxed and sealed for evidence. Among them were several notebooks, religious pamphlets, and a folder labeled Personal Reflection. Inside that folder was his final written line, dated the same day he died. "Justice is not revenge. It's acceptance." The meaning was never clarified. The unseen files close. Following the incident, the Department of Corrections quietly reclassified all documents under the Dahmer dossier as restricted material. Only select federal investigators and psychologists retained copies. Unofficially, the files became legend, a forbidden archive of interviews, sketches, and reports that revealed how a man could live with horror and still function like anyone else. Years later, fragments of the dossier leaked to journalists. Among them was a final psychological evaluation written weeks before his death. It read, "Subject demonstrates stable mood, minimal anxiety, and no signs of aggression. Expresses acceptance of divine judgment. Indicates awareness of hostility from peers, yet refuses protective custody." In hindsight, that note sounded like prophecy. He didn't want protection. He wanted resolution. The world reacts. When the news reached Milwaukee, crowds gathered outside the old Oxford apartment site, now an empty grass lot where his former building had been demolished. Some prayed. Others celebrated. One woman held a sign reading, "Peace for the victims at last." Television anchors repeated the headline for days, "Jeffrey Dahmer killed in prison." Yet behind the headlines, psychologists debated what his death truly meant. Had justice been served? Or had the system allowed revenge to finish the job it started? Reverend Ratcliffe, the minister who baptized him, spoke publicly only once. If he truly found faith, he said, then he met God that morning. Others weren't so sure. One of Dahmer's former guards told reporters, "He never looked afraid, even at the end. It's like he knew this was a final step." Echoes and legacy. After the investigation closed, Dahmer's remains were cremated. His ashes were divided between his parents. Two people united only by loss and questions that would never have answers. The state destroyed his belongings. His cell was reassigned. But even years later, officers avoided that corner of the unit. Some swore the light above the bed flickered at night. Columbia Correctional Institution returned to routine, but the legend of Jeffrey Dahmer never left. His story became documentaries, books, and case studies. Every time new evidence surfaced, old wounds reopened. For families, for investigators, and for anyone who tried to understand how calm could hide such cruelty. The final page of the Dahmer dossier carried a single stamp phrase, "Case concluded. Do not release." But conclusion is an illusion. Decades later, Dahmer's name still draws curiosity and fear. His life behind bars reminds the world that evil doesn't always roar. It often whispers, smiles politely, and fades quietly into the background. In the end, the monster did not escape his cell. The cell escaped him. And somewhere in those unseen files, a single sentence remains unredacted. His own words, written months before the end. The silence isn't punishment. It's home.